Picture your wedding night. Now imagine your new spouse handing you a sword and saying, "Prove you're worth marrying." That actually happened. Viking brides could demand their grooms fight armed men, complete deadly tasks, or risk their lives just to consummate the marriage. This wasn't some cute tradition or symbolic gesture. Men died trying to pass these tests, and if they failed, instant divorce, public humiliation, social death. Tonight you're learning about a culture where love had nothing to do with marriage, and your wedding night might involve actual combat. Alright, get comfortable, grab your favourite pillow, maybe some tea, whatever helps you wind down. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. These historical deep dives happen weekly, and trust me, each one gets wilder. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how these stories travel around the world while people are getting ready for sleep. Tonight we're heading to medieval Scandinavia, where marriage was basically warfare by other means. Ready for something completely different? Viking brides, not your typical romance. Let's start with what you think you know about Vikings. Bearded guys with horned helmets sailing around pillaging villages, right? That's mostly Hollywood nonsense. Real Vikings lived from about 790 to 1100 CE in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Scandinavia back then meant brutal winters, constant warfare, and survival depending on your ability to fight, farm, and defend what was yours. In this environment, marriage wasn't about finding your soulmate. It was about creating alliances that might keep your family alive another year. Here's what gets me about Viking culture. They valued strength and courage above almost everything else. Your reputation could determine whether you lived or died. If people thought you were weak, your enemies would smell blood in the water. Your friends might abandon you. Even your own family could disown you if you brought shame on the household name. So when Vikings got married, they weren't just exchanging vows. They were testing whether this person was strong enough to be worthy of their bloodline. And that testing started on the wedding night. Marriage negotiations happened between families, not the actual couple. Think arranged marriages, but with more weapons involved. The groom's family paid a bride price, proving they had wealth and could support a wife. The bride's family provided a dowry that stayed hers even if the marriage fell apart. So money was changing hands, alliances were forming, property was being redistributed. But here's the twist. Even after all that negotiation, the bride could still reject her husband if he failed her tests. On their wedding night, the Icelandic sagas. These are epic stories written down centuries later, but describing real Viking Age events. They're full of accounts of wedding night tests that sound absolutely insane today. In one saga, a bride demands her new husband fight a rival who'd previously courted her. Not a symbolic duel, actual combat with real weapons where people could die. In another story, a woman sends her groom to steal a valuable cloak from dangerous enemies on their wedding night. If he couldn't handle that, how could he protect her from raiders? Wait, this next part's wild. Some brides arranged actual ambushes for their grooms. Picture this. You're a Viking guy walking to your wedding chamber, probably drunk on mead, thinking about your beautiful new wife. Suddenly armed men jump out of the shadows. Your bride is testing whether you can fight your way to her. If you run, you fail. If you fight and lose, you might die. If you fight and win, congratulations, you've proven you're worthy of consummating the marriage. That's not romance, that's survival of the fittest with wedding bells. Not all tests involved combat though. Some brides preferred testing intelligence. They'd challenge grooms to riddle contests, questions about law or navigation, demonstrations of poetry skills. Vikings respected cleverness as much as strength, maybe more. A stupid strong guy might win battles but lose wars. So a groom who couldn't answer his bride's riddles might find himself publicly humiliated before all the wedding guests. In a culture where reputation was everything, intellectual failure could be worse than physical cowardice. Both could destroy your standing completely. The most extreme tests were basically death sentences with extra steps. One saga describes a bride who made her groom stay awake all night guarding against potential attackers instead of sleeping with her. Another woman sent her husband to retrieve something valuable from a famously violent neighbouring clan. These weren't romantic gestures. They were genuine trials where failure meant humiliation and success meant maybe you were tough enough to survive Viking marriage. Some grooms actually died attempting these tests. Some brides arranged it that way on purpose. Here's what's fascinating about women's motivations for these tests. Some genuinely wanted strong husbands and used wedding night challenges to verify what they'd been told about their groom's abilities. Others had been forced into unwanted marriages and saw testing as a way to escape. If the groom died or fled, the marriage was over. Still others used tests to establish power dynamics from day one. A husband who submitted to his wife's trials might be more likely to respect her authority within the household afterward. Viking divorce laws were actually pretty progressive for medieval times. A woman could divorce her husband for impotence, extreme poverty, wearing women's clothing, or, and this is key, failing to adequately provide protection. If a groom bombed his wedding night tests so badly that his wife felt endangered by having such an incompetent husband, she could divorce him immediately. The process was simple: declare the marriage over before witnesses, reclaim your dowry, and leave. No lengthy legal proceedings, no needing permission from male relatives. The consequences of failing these tests could destroy a man's entire future. In Viking culture, your reputation was literally everything. Sagas describe failed grooms becoming objects of mockery, with poets composing verses about their cowardice or incompetence. Some guys left their communities entirely after failing wedding night tests, joining raiding expeditions, or moving somewhere their humiliation wasn't known. Others challenged their ex-wives' male relatives to combat, trying to restore honor through violence. That sometimes sparked blood feuds lasting generations. Now, not every Viking wedding involved dramatic life or death challenges. Among lower social classes, practical concerns dominated. Poor couples needed to work together immediately to survive. No time for elaborate tests, when there's farming to do and mouths to feed. The sagas mostly describe elite families where honor and reputation mattered enormously. Rich people had the luxury of staging dangerous wedding night dramas. For most Vikings, the wedding night probably just involved drinking massive amounts of alcohol and consummating the marriage while extended family celebrated loudly nearby. What's crazy is how this system created weird gender dynamics. Legally, Viking women had less authority than men, but practically, they wielded enormous power through their right to test, refuse or divorce husbands. Marriage served the community, not individual desires. The wedding night test wasn't about personal feelings, it was about ensuring the alliance between families would be strong enough to survive constant warfare, raiding and feuding. Your marriage had to benefit everyone, not just you and your spouse. Archaeological evidence supports some of this. High-status Viking women's graves contain weapons alongside domestic items, suggesting they were viewed as potential fighters, not just housekeepers. Legal codes written after Christianity arrived still mention women's rights to demand various proofs from husbands. The sagas themselves, while literary rather than purely historical, were written for audiences who would have rejected them as unrealistic if they contradicted known customs too dramatically. This stuff really happened, even if details got exaggerated over time. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine your wedding night including combat trials or dangerous quests to prove your worth. For Vikings, marriage was too important to leave to chance or sentiment. A bride who didn't test her groom might end up with a coward who'd flee when enemies came. A groom who failed deserved humiliation because he'd proven inadequate for Viking life. They weren't being cruel, they were being practical in ways survival demanded. But what happened after these tests? That's where things get really interesting, The power of a Viking bride. Here's what's wild about Viking women. Legally, they were basically property. Fathers controlled them, then husbands took over. Classic medieval setup, right? But here's where it gets interesting. While the law said one thing, reality was completely different. Viking women ran entire farms while their husbands were off raiding. They controlled household finances, made major decisions about crops, livestock, trade deals, and on their wedding night, they could literally test their new husband's worthiness, make him fight, solve riddles, complete dangerous tasks, power through practice, not paperwork. Think about that contradiction for a second. You're legally nobody, but you're managing a complex agricultural operation, negotiating with merchants, and deciding whether your new husband deserves to consummate the marriage. Viking society created this weird space where women had almost no official rights, but massive practical authority. And it all started with marriage negotiations, because Viking marriages weren't about love. They were business deals, alliance contracts between families. And every good contract needs terms, conditions, and ways to verify you're getting what you paid for. Marriage negotiations began months before the wedding, sometimes years. The groom's family would approach the bride's family through intermediaries, professional matchmakers who knew everyone's wealth, reputation, and family connections. These weren't romantic conversations. They were economic assessments. Can this family defend their land? Do they have the resources to support our daughter? Will this alliance help us in future conflicts? The bride herself rarely participated in these discussions, but don't assume she was powerless. Smart families consulted their daughters privately. Her opinions mattered. They just weren't publicly acknowledged. The bride price, or munda in Old Norse, was the groom's payment to the bride's family. This wasn't buying a wife. It was compensation for losing a valuable household member. Viking women worked hard. They spun wool, wove cloth, managed dairies, supervised servants. Losing a daughter meant losing significant labour and economic production. The bride price acknowledged this loss while demonstrating the groom had enough wealth to support a wife. Typical amounts, equivalent to several years' income for an average farmer. This wasn't pocket change, it was serious financial commitment. But here's the twist. The bride received her own payment too. The dowry, or heimanfylgja. This was property that belonged to her personally. If the marriage failed, she took it with her. No questions asked. This gave Viking women something unprecedented in medieval Europe: economic independence. A woman with a substantial dowry couldn't be easily abandoned or mistreated. Her husband knew she could leave, taking valuable assets with her. Suddenly that legally powerless woman had real leverage. Divorce meant he lost not just a wife, but significant wealth. The dowry typically included practical items, livestock, farm tools, household goods, sometimes land, but wealthy families included luxury items too. Silver jewellery, fine fabrics, imported spices. These weren't just status symbols. They were portable wealth that retained value across different communities. A woman fleeing a bad marriage could sell these items to support herself while establishing a new household. It's basically medieval insurance policy. Protection against husband's death, divorce, or abuse. Revolutionary thinking for the time period. So by the wedding day, significant money had changed hands. Both families had invested heavily in this alliance. The bride held valuable property. The groom had proven his financial capability. Everyone had skin in the game. But Viking culture valued one thing above wealth: competence. Raw ability to survive and thrive in a dangerous world. Money meant nothing if your husband couldn't defend the farm, couldn't make good decisions under pressure, couldn't stand up to enemies. This is where the wedding night traditions get interesting, because testing began immediately. Wedding night tests weren't romantic traditions. They were practical evaluations. Think job interviews with weapons involved. A bride might arrange for male relatives to ambush the groom as he approached the bridal chamber, force him to fight his way to his wife. Sounds extreme. In a culture where raids were common, a husband who couldn't handle a surprise attack was useless. If he panicked during staged combat, what would happen when real enemies appeared? These tests revealed character under pressure, and character determined survival. Other brides preferred intellectual challenges. Riddle contests were popular, complex wordplay that tested memory, wit, and cultural knowledge. Navigation problems that verified the groom understood seamanship. Legal puzzles that confirmed he knew his rights and responsibilities. Vikings respected clever men as much as strong ones. A husband who could outthink enemies was as valuable as one who could outfight them. These mental tests often happened publicly, with wedding guests judging the groom's performance. Failing meant immediate humiliation before your new community. The most extreme tests involved dangerous tasks. Sagas describe brides sending grooms to retrieve valuable items from hostile neighbours, essentially requiring them to risk their lives proving devotion. One story tells of a bride who demanded her husband spend the entire wedding night standing guard, refusing to sleep with him until he'd proven he could stay alert while protecting her. Another describes a groom forced to single-handedly defend the wedding feast from mock raiders. These weren't games. Vikings took their tests seriously. Failure had real consequences. Women's motivations for testing varied dramatically. Some genuinely wanted capable husbands and used the wedding night to verify what they'd heard about the groom's abilities. Others had been forced into unwanted marriages and used tests to humiliate or even eliminate unwanted partners. There are saga accounts of brides who arranged genuine ambushes, hoping the groom would die and free them from the marriage. Still others saw testing as establishing power dynamics from day one. A husband who submitted to his wife's tests might respect her authority afterward. Failed tests had serious consequences. In a reputation-based culture, wedding night failures became community knowledge immediately. Poets composed mocking verses about cowardly grooms. Some failed husbands left their communities entirely, joining raiding expeditions or moving to new settlements where their humiliation wasn't known. Others challenged their ex-wives' male relatives to combat, trying to restore honor through violence. This sometimes started blood feuds lasting generations. The stakes weren't just personal pride, they were social survival in an honor-obsessed culture. But successful tests established the groom's credibility permanently. A man who impressed his bride and her family on the wedding night gained respect that lasted years. His children inherited that reputation. His alliances strengthened. Future business partners took him more seriously. Wedding night success was like passing a highly public certification exam. It verified you belonged among competent adults in Viking society. This is why grooms took these tests seriously, despite the risks. Passing meant social advancement. Failing meant social death. The economic implications were huge too. Remember that bride price and dowry. If the marriage failed immediately due to wedding night inadequacy, the financial arrangements unraveled. The groom's family lost their investment. The bride's family might return the bride price, but kept the dowry. This created powerful incentives for everyone to make sure grooms were properly prepared. Families didn't want to lose fortunes due to incompetent sons or sons-in-law. Marriage preparation became serious business with real financial stakes. Not every Viking wedding included dramatic tests. Among ordinary farmers, practical concerns dominated. Couples needed to work together immediately to survive. They didn't have time for elaborate challenges or the resources to risk losing capable partners. The sagas mostly describe elite families where honor and reputation mattered enormously, and where wedding night dramas made good stories. For most Vikings, the wedding night probably involved heavy drinking, loud celebrating, and consummating the marriage with extended family partying in the next room. But even ordinary weddings included some form of evaluation. maybe just observing how the groom handled wedding day stress, how he interacted with his new in-laws, whether he showed appropriate respect or dangerous arrogance. These subtle tests still mattered because Viking marriages were community affairs. Everyone had opinions about whether the match would work, and everyone would remember how the groom performed when reputation became important later. The wedding night was just the beginning of lifelong assessment. But those dramatic tests, those set the tone for everything that followed. Wedding night trials, a test of grit. Picture this. It's your wedding night in 10th century Iceland. You've paid the bride price. Families have celebrated. Everyone's drunk on mead. But your new wife isn't leading you to bed. Instead, she's pointing to 3 armed men, blocking the door to your chamber. Fight them, she says calmly. Prove you're worthy of me. This isn't fiction. This happened. Viking brides could literally test their grooms through combat, cunning or endurance before consummating marriage. Why would a woman do this to her new husband? Because in Viking culture, marriage wasn't about love. It was about survival. Your wife needed to know you could defend the farm when raiders came. Could you avenge family honor? Could you father children brave enough to survive? A coward for a husband meant death for everyone. So brides tested grooms when motivation was highest, right when they most wanted to prove themselves worthy of their new wife's bed. The Icelandic sagas are packed with these stories. In Egil's saga, a bride refuses to consummate her marriage until her groom defeats a rival who'd previously courted her. She watches from the window as her new husband fights this other man with swords. Only after he wins, blood on his clothes, does she let him into the bridal chamber. Think about that. Your wedding night might literally include killing someone to prove you deserve your bride. Laxdæla saga tells an even stranger story. A woman named Gudrun sends her new husband to steal a valuable cloak from a dangerous rival's household on their wedding night. While she waits in bed, the groom has to sneak into enemy territory, outwit guards, steal the cloak, and make it back alive. Only then would she consider him clever and brave enough to father her children. Medieval special ops as foreplay, absolutely wild. Combat tests were the most common. Brides arranged for male relatives to ambush grooms approaching the bridal chamber, sometimes with real weapons, sometimes with blunted swords for safety, but always with genuine intent to test courage and fighting skill. A groom who ran or fought poorly might find his new wife refusing him. Wedding guests would watch and judge, fail publicly, and your reputation was destroyed before your marriage even began. Not every test involved violence. Viking culture valued clever men almost as much as strong ones. Some brides set riddle contests, complex puzzles about law, poetry, or navigation that tested intelligence and education. A groom who couldn't answer might be deemed too stupid for marriage. These intellectual trials could be just as humiliating as combat failures. Vikings respected wit. A man who lacked cleverness couldn't lead a household or negotiate with other clans. The most extreme tests involved genuine mortal danger. Gisla Saga describes a bride who forces her groom to stand guard all wedding night, refusing sleep while watching for attackers. If he dozed off, the marriage was over. Another saga mentions a bride who sent her groom to retrieve treasure from a clan known for killing trespassers. These weren't games. Grooms sometimes died attempting these trials. Death was preferable to the shame of failing. Why did women demand such brutal tests? Sometimes they genuinely wanted strong husbands and used trials to verify what they'd heard about grooms. But other times, they'd been forced into unwanted marriages. Setting impossible tests was revenge, or escape. If the groom died during trials, the bride was free. Some arranged genuine ambushes, hoping for exactly that outcome. Wedding night murder, disguised as testing for worthiness. Failing these tests was social suicide. Sagas describe grooms who failed becoming objects of mockery. Poets composed verses about their cowardice. In a culture where reputation was everything, this humiliation could be worse than death. Some failed grooms fled their communities entirely, joining raiding expeditions where their shame wasn't known. Others challenged their ex-wives' male relatives to combat, trying to restore honor through violence. Blood feuds sometimes lasted generations because of failed wedding night tests. The consequences rippled through entire families. A failed groom might have to return the bride price, bankrupting his household. His siblings' marriage prospects suffered because everyone knew the family produced cowards. Meanwhile, the bride's family faced questions about why they'd chosen such an inadequate husband. Sometimes these failures sparked feuds between clans, each blaming the other for the humiliation. One wedding night could destroy multiple families' reputations permanently. Archaeological evidence supports these practices indirectly. High-status Viking women's graves contain weapons alongside domestic items, suggesting women were viewed as potential fighters, not just household managers. Legal codes written after Christianization mention women's rights to demand proofs from husbands and divorce for inadequacy. The sagas themselves, while literary rather than historical documents, were written for audiences who'd reject unrealistic customs. They reflect real Viking expectations. Religion complicated these practices. Pre-Christian Vikings invoked Freyja for love and fertility, Thor for strength. Wedding ceremonies included animal sacrifices asking gods for strong children. After Christianization around 1000 CE, priests tried eliminating wedding night tests, considering them barbaric and potentially deadly. But the traditions persisted in modified forms for generations. Old customs died hard in a culture that respected strength above almost everything else. Viking divorce laws gave women real power here. A wife could divorce her husband for impotence, cowardice, or failing wedding night tests, so badly she felt endangered by his incompetence. The process was simple: declare the marriage over before witnesses, reclaim your dowry, leave. This gave teeth to the testing tradition. Husbands who failed faced not just humiliation, but immediate divorce and property loss. Very effective motivation system. These dramatic tests mostly happened among elite families where honor mattered enormously and good stories got remembered. Among poorer Vikings, practical concerns dominated. Couples needed to work together immediately for survival, leaving little time for elaborate challenges. But the sagas focus on the wealthy and powerful, where wedding night dramas made compelling tales. Most ordinary Vikings probably skipped the combat trials and went straight to making babies. These traditions left lasting cultural marks. Nordic emphasis on gender equality might have ancient roots in Viking women's unusual authority within marriages. The right to test and reject husbands established cultural memory that women weren't passive marriage recipients but active participants who could demand competence from partners. Modern Nordic marriage laws emphasizing equality and easy divorce may be distant descendants of Viking wives' power to dissolve inadequate marriages through testing. So there you have it, Viking wedding nights where brides tested grooms through combat, riddles or dangerous quests before allowing consummation. Marriage was too important to leave to chance or sentiment. It required verification, proof of capability. A bride who didn't test her groom might end up with a coward who'd flee when raiders came. Brutal? Absolutely. But in their violent world, these tests served real survival purposes. They weren't being cruel, just practical. Honor, strength, and survival. The Golden Triad. Here's what you need to understand about Viking wedding night trials. They weren't sadistic games. They were job interviews. Deadly serious evaluations where failure meant more than embarrassment. It meant your bloodline might not survive winter. Because in 9th century Scandinavia, marriage wasn't about finding your soulmate. It was about finding someone capable of keeping you alive. And if that sounds harsh, well, wait until you hear about their daily reality. Picture waking up every morning, not knowing if today's the day. Raiders burn your farm, or if the harvest fails and your children starve, or if a neighbor decides your family insulted his honor and comes for blood. This was Viking life, constant grinding danger, where one wrong choice, one moment of weakness, could destroy everything you'd built. In that world, choosing a weak partner wasn't just a mistake, it was basically suicide, with extra steps. So when a Viking bride looked at her new husband on their wedding night, she wasn't seeing romance. She was seeing a business partner in the enterprise of staying alive. Could he fight off attackers? Would he crack under pressure? Was he smart enough to negotiate, brave enough to lead, strong enough to work? These weren't optional qualities, they were survival requirements, and testing him immediately made perfect sense. If you think like someone who might die tomorrow, let me paint you a picture of what daily dangers actually meant. Sea raiders who could appear without warning, neighbours who'd kill you over insults to their honour, famines that lasted years, diseases that wiped out entire settlements, wild animals, brutal winters where running out of firewood meant freezing to death, and constant, exhausting physical labour just to survive another day. Now imagine facing all of that with a partner who might fold when things get tough. What made someone worthy in Viking culture? 3 things formed the Golden Triad. Honour, which meant keeping your word even when it hurt, avenging insults even when it was dangerous, maintaining your reputation no matter the cost. Strength, physical, yes, but also mental toughness, the ability to endure pain and keep fighting. And survival instinct, quick thinking under pressure. Practical skills, the wisdom to know when to fight and when to run. Miss any of these, you're useless. Here's the brutal mathematics of Viking marriage. A strong husband might mean your children survive to adulthood. A weak one meant watching them die. A brave husband meant raiders think twice about attacking your farm. A coward meant becoming an easy target. A smart husband meant navigating politics, making allies, avoiding deadly feuds. A fool meant destroying relationships that kept your family safe. Every choice had life or death consequences. Romance was a luxury they couldn't afford. From a Viking woman's perspective, the wedding night test wasn't cruel, it was the most important decision she'd ever make. She's about to trust this man with her life, her children's lives, her family's future. Shouldn't she verify he's capable before it's too late? The sagas tell us brides who skipped testing often regretted it. Husbands who seemed strong in daylight sometimes crumbled when real danger came. Better to know now, while you could still escape the marriage. And Viking men understood the stakes too. They knew marriage meant becoming responsible for another person's survival in an unforgiving world. The smart ones welcomed testing because it proved they were worthy. The weak ones complained, which immediately marked them as unsuitable. This wasn't about male pride or female power. It was about practical reality. If you couldn't handle your bride testing you, how would you handle genuine threats later? Better to fail the test than fail when lives depended on you. So let's break down this golden triad. Honor, strength, survival. These weren't abstract concepts. They were measurable qualities that determined whether you lived or died. Honor meant other Vikings respected you, which meant potential allies in fights. It meant keeping oaths, which meant people trusted you with information and resources. Lose your honor, and you become an outcast. In Viking society, outcasts didn't last long. They had nobody to turn to when trouble came, and trouble always came. Honor functioned like a credit rating in their world. Good honor meant people would lend you weapons, share information about threats, invite you into profitable raids or trading ventures. Bad honor meant isolation. And here's the thing, your spouse's honor reflected on you too. Marry someone dishonored, and their shame becomes your shame. Their enemies become your enemies. Their bad reputation damages your family's standing. Viking brides needed to verify their groom's honor was real, not just claimed. Strength meant more than muscle. Though muscle mattered, it meant enduring pain without breaking, working through exhaustion, fighting when you're already wounded, making hard decisions under pressure. Mental toughness was just as crucial as physical power. A Viking might need to row for days straight, work through harvest season, or stay alert during long winter nights guarding against attacks. Weakness in any form could get everyone killed. That's why brides tested for all kinds of strength. Survival skills covered everything practical: navigation at sea, reading weather patterns, knowing which plants were edible during famines, understanding animal behavior for hunting, recognizing signs of disease in livestock, managing food stores through winter, negotiating with hostile neighbors. These skills meant the difference between prosperity and starvation, between safety and death. A husband who lacked them was essentially useless. Worse than useless, he was a burden who consumed resources without contributing anything valuable. This is why Viking culture had zero tolerance for weakness. Not because they were naturally cruel, but because weakness killed people. A weak link in the family chain could destroy everyone. Think about it. If your husband panics during a raid, he might run instead of fighting, leaving you defenseless. If he's too stupid to manage resources, your family starves. If he's too cowardly to maintain honor, you lose allies and gain enemies. Weakness wasn't just personal failure, it was betrayal of everyone depending on you. The logical brutality of it all makes sense once you understand their world. Every Viking family existed on the edge of disaster. One bad harvest, one successful raid against them, one deadly feud, and they're finished. In that environment, choosing a mate became the highest stakes decision possible. Get it right and your bloodline survives, maybe even prospers. Get it wrong and everything ends. The wedding night trials weren't about being mean to new husbands. They were about preventing catastrophic mistakes. So when a Viking bride announced she wanted to test her groom, everyone understood why. She was doing her due diligence, verifying the product before completing the purchase, making sure her new partner met the standards her survival demanded. And those standards were high because the consequences of failure were so severe. The specific tests varied. Some focused on courage, others on intelligence, still others on physical capability. But they all served the same purpose: separating worthy men from pretenders. What exactly did these trials look like? How did a Viking bride test her groom's courage, his intelligence, his worthiness to join her family and protect her future children? Some tests were elegant, almost ritualistic. Others were brutal, potentially deadly. All of them revealed truth about the men facing them, and that truth determined whether the marriage continued or ended before it truly began. The trials themselves are what we turn to next, and some of them will shock you. Ambushes and power dynamics. The wedding feast is over. Guests are drunk on mead. The groom walks alone toward the bridal chamber, expecting, well, what any groom expects. Instead, 3 armed men step from the shadows, swords drawn. This isn't random violence. This is his wife's idea. She arranged this. While he was celebrating, she was planning his first test as her husband. And here's the thing that gets me about this. She's watching, probably from a window, waiting to see if the man she just married can actually fight, or if he'll run. Picture this moment. You've just pledged your life to someone, exchanged vows, made promises, and your new wife's wedding gift, a potential death trap. Because that's what these ambushes were. Real swords, real blood, real consequences. The groom doesn't know if these men are supposed to kill him or just rough him up. Neither do the attackers, honestly. Viking culture valued strength above almost everything else. A bride who didn't test her groom might end up married to a coward. Better to find out now. The logic was brutal but practical. If your husband can't handle 3 guys on his wedding night, when he's supposedly at his strongest, most motivated, most ready to prove himself. How's he going to defend your farm when real raiders come? How's he going to protect your children? How's he going to fight in the blood feuds that defined Viking life? Your bride isn't being cruel, she's being smart. Because in her world, marrying a weak man could get your entire family killed. Egil's saga describes exactly this scenario. The bride arranges for her cousins to wait outside the bridal chamber. Armed with real weapons, the groom shows up expecting romance and gets combat instead. He fights them off, barely, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. Only then does she let him inside. Only then does the real wedding night begin. And the saga treats this as normal, expected, just another part of Viking marriage customs. Because strength wasn't optional, it was survival. But here's where it gets interesting. Some brides hoped their grooms would fail. Seriously, if you'd been forced into an unwanted marriage, if your father sold you to some guy you hated, arranging a deadly ambush might be your only way out. Let the attackers get carried away. Let them actually kill him. Claim it was an accident. A test gone wrong. Suddenly you're a widow, not a wife. Free to marry someone you actually want. Or free to stay single and manage your own land. The ambushes took different forms. Sometimes it was family members, cousins, brothers, even the bride's father, testing his new son-in-law. Sometimes it was hired men, local warriors paid to attack, but not necessarily kill. Sometimes it was actual enemies, guys who'd wanted to marry the bride themselves, now getting official permission to beat up their successful rival. The bride could customize her test based on how much she actually wanted this marriage to work out. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Viking grave goods show women buried with weapons alongside household items. Not ceremonial weapons, real ones, battle-tested. These weren't delicate flowers waiting to be protected. These were partners in a warrior culture. They expected their husbands to fight because they could fight too. A woman who could swing a sword herself had zero patience for a man who couldn't. The wedding night ambush wasn't just testing his strength, it was testing his worthiness to stand beside her. The psychological aspect was just as important as the physical. How does he react under surprise attack? Does he freeze, run, fight smart, or fight wild? A groom who panicked in a controlled situation with his wife watching, how would he handle real danger when lives depended on him? Vikings valued quick thinking as much as sword skill. The ambush tested both. It tested whether he could make life or death decisions under pressure, whether he was actually husband material. Some grooms figured it out. Smart ones realized their bride was testing them and played along. They fought hard enough to prove their skill, but held back enough to avoid actually killing anyone. Because murdering your wife's relatives on your wedding night, that's not great for family relationships. The best grooms turned it into performance, showing off their combat skills, their tactical thinking, their ability to handle pressure, making their wife proud instead of just surviving her test. But failure? Failure was catastrophic. Not just the physical danger, though that was real enough. The social consequences were worse. Word spreads fast in Viking communities. Everyone would know you couldn't handle your wedding night ambush. Poets would compose verses mocking your cowardice. Your wife might divorce you immediately, taking back her dowry and leaving you humiliated. Other women would reject you. Men would question your courage. Your reputation, your most valuable possession in Viking culture, would be destroyed forever. The sagas describe grooms who ran from their wedding night ambushes. They never recovered socially. Some left their communities entirely, joining raiding expeditions where their cowardice wasn't known. Others challenged their ex-wives' male relatives to single combat, trying to restore their honor through violence, which sometimes worked, but usually just got them killed. Because a man who couldn't handle a planned test probably couldn't handle real combat either. Their desperation made them sloppy, predictable, dead. The timing mattered too. These ambushes happened after the feast but before consummation. That wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. The marriage wasn't legally complete until consummated. If the groom failed his test so badly that the bride rejected him, if he ran, or begged, or proved himself a coward, she could annul the marriage that same night. No legal complications, no drawn-out divorce proceedings, just a failed test and a returned bride price. Clean, simple, brutal. Lower-class Vikings probably skipped these elaborate tests. When you're farming marginal land and fighting starvation, you don't have time for wedding night combat trials. You need your husband working, not bleeding. But among the elite, among the families whose alliances shaped Viking politics, these tests were essential. They weren't entertainment, they were quality control, making sure the alliance you just formed through marriage was actually worth something, that your new family member could pull his weight. Christian missionaries hated these practices, called them barbaric, tried to eliminate them when Vikings converted to Christianity around 1000 CE, but the traditions persisted in modified forms for generations, because the underlying need hadn't changed. Vikings still lived in a violent world. They still needed strong partners. They still valued courage above almost everything else. Converting to Christianity didn't make their enemies disappear. It didn't make their harsh environment gentle. The wedding night tests evolved, but they didn't vanish. What fascinates me about these ambushes is the power dynamic they reveal. Yes, Viking women had fewer legal rights than men, but on their wedding night, they held all the cards. They could test, judge, accept, or reject their new husbands based on performance. They controlled whether the marriage actually began or ended before it started. That's incredible power for a supposedly patriarchal society. The bride wasn't a passive recipient of marriage. She was an active evaluator of her potential partner's worth. But passing the ambush was just the beginning. It proved you could fight when surprised. It proved you wouldn't run from danger. It proved you understood that strength mattered in Viking culture. But it didn't prove you could provide for a family. It didn't prove you were wise enough to avoid unnecessary fights. It didn't prove you'd be faithful, or kind, or any of the other things marriages actually need. The ambush was just the first test. There were others waiting, much harder ones. Intellectual challenges, valuing brains over brawn. So here's what blew my mind when I first read this. Not every Viking wedding night test involved swords or wrestling matches. Some brides preferred to test their groom's intelligence instead. Picture this. You're a Viking warrior, feeling pretty confident about your combat skills, and your new bride sits you down for a riddle contest. Yeah, that's right. She's not asking you to fight 3 men. She's asking you to solve puzzles. And failing, that was just as humiliating as losing a sword fight. Viking culture had this fascinating balance between brawn and brains that modern people totally miss. We picture Vikings as mindless berserkers, all muscle and rage. But these people navigated by the stars across unknown seas. They had complex legal systems. They composed poetry that took genuine skill to memorize and perform. A Viking who couldn't think his way through problems? He was dead weight. So when a bride tested her groom's intellect, she wasn't being mean, she was being smart, because stupid husbands got families killed. The riddle contests were serious business. These weren't simple word games. Viking riddles tested knowledge of mythology, law, navigation, even poetry composition. A typical challenge might sound like this. I know of something that travels without feet, speaks without a mouth, and carries warriors to their deaths. The answer, a ship. But get it wrong, and everyone at your wedding just witnessed you fail your first test as a husband. The bride's family would be thinking, did we just tie ourselves to an idiot? Legal knowledge was huge in these tests. Vikings had incredibly complex laws about everything: property rights, compensation for injuries, proper procedures for divorce. A good husband needed to know this stuff because he'd be representing his family in legal disputes. So brides would quiz their grooms. What's the proper wordguild for killing someone's horse? Or name 3 grounds for legal divorce. Wrong answers meant you couldn't protect your family's interests. And in Viking society, that made you worse than useless. You were dangerous. Navigation tests were brilliant. Remember, Vikings travelled thousands of miles by sea without compasses. They used the sun, stars, wave patterns, even bird flight paths to find their way. A bride might ask her groom to explain how to sail to Iceland using only the North Star, or how to read ocean swells to find land. This wasn't academic knowledge, this was survival skill. A husband who couldn't navigate might get the whole family lost at sea, so testing this on the wedding night, absolutely practical. Poetry composition was another common test, and this one's kind of beautiful. Vikings loved their skaldic poetry, these complex metaphor-heavy verses that took real skill to create. A bride might demand her groom compose a poem about her beauty, or their future together, right there on the spot. The catch? It had to follow traditional metre, and include proper kennings, those elaborate metaphors Vikings used. Battle sweat for blood, whale road for ocean. Fail to compose decent poetry, and you'd just proven you lacked cultural sophistication. Embarrassing. Here's what's fascinating. These intellectual tests often happened alongside physical ones. A bride might make her groom fight off attackers, then immediately sit him down for a quiz about maritime law, talk about pressure. You're probably bleeding from sword cuts, adrenaline still pumping, and now you need to recite legal precedents. The message was clear. Being a Viking husband required both kinds of strength, physical courage and mental sharpness. One without the other wasn't enough to protect a Viking household from the dangers they faced. The sagas give us some incredible examples of these intellectual challenges. In one story, a bride presents her groom with a series of increasingly difficult riddles about the gods. Each correct answer earned him a cup of mead. Each wrong answer, she poured the mead on the ground. The symbolism was brutal. Wrong answers meant wasted resources, and wasted resources meant dead families in Viking times. By the end of the contest, everyone watching knew exactly how smart or stupid this new husband was. Some brides tested their groom's knowledge of runes. Vikings used runic alphabet for writing, but it wasn't just letters. Runes had magical and legal significance. A bride might carve runes into wood and ask her groom to read them, or demand he write out a proper marriage contract using runic script. This tested literacy, legal knowledge, and understanding of Norse magical practices all at once. Failing meant you couldn't even document your own marriage properly. In a culture where written agreements mattered, that was genuinely dangerous incompetence. Memory tests were particularly cruel. Vikings passed down laws, genealogies, and stories through oral tradition. A good man was expected to memorize vast amounts of information, so a bride might demand her groom recite the genealogy of her family going back 5 generations, or list the kings of Denmark in proper order. Forget names or mix up dates, and you'd just shown you couldn't even remember your new wife's ancestry. That was insulting to her entire bloodline, and everyone present knew it. Trading knowledge came up in these tests too. Vikings weren't just raiders, they were merchants who travelled from Greenland to Constantinople. A smart bride would test whether her groom understood exchange rates, quality assessment of goods, or trade route planning. How much silver for a barrel of amber? Which ports pay best for walrus ivory? Get these wrong, and you'd proven you couldn't contribute to the family's wealth. In a society where trading voyages could make or break a household, economic ignorance was legitimately terrifying. The thing about these intellectual tests, they revealed something profound about Viking values. Physical strength was temporary. You get old, you get injured, eventually you can't swing a sword effectively, but knowledge, that lasted. A man who understood law could settle disputes without bloodshed. A man who could navigate could lead trading expeditions. A man who composed poetry could preserve family history for future generations. So when brides tested intelligence alongside strength, they were thinking long term. They wanted partners, not just warriors. Failing these intellectual tests carried the same shame as failing physical ones. Vikings had this concept called nith, a kind of cosmic dishonor that stuck to cowards and fools alike. A man who couldn't answer his bride's riddles was nith. His failure reflected on both families and could damage alliances for generations. Some grooms who failed intellectual tests left their communities entirely, joining raiding parties or sailing to new settlements where their humiliation wasn't known. The shame was that intense. Women who administered these tests weren't being cruel for fun. They were protecting their futures in the most practical way possible. A stupid husband might agree to unfavorable trades, get the family lost during migrations, or fail to understand legal obligations. In Viking society, where one person's incompetence could doom entire households, testing intellectual capacity wasn't optional. It was survival strategy. These brides were doing their due diligence before legally binding themselves to someone who might destroy everything through sheer ignorance. What strikes me about these intellectual challenges is how they balance the gender dynamics in Viking marriage. Yes, women had less formal legal power than men, but the wedding night tests, both physical and intellectual, gave brides genuine authority to evaluate and potentially reject their husbands. A woman who could expose her groom's ignorance in front of both families held real power in that moment. She was demonstrating that intelligence mattered, that wisdom had value, that marriage required more than just muscle. These intellectual wedding night trials show us Vikings at their most sophisticated. They weren't the mindless barbarians Hollywood portrays. They were people who understood that survival required both physical and mental strength, who valued wisdom enough to test for it at the most crucial moment of marriage. When a Viking bride demanded her groom solve riddles or demonstrate legal knowledge, she was upholding cultural values that recognized intelligence as essential for survival. Not just brawn, brains too, both together, or the marriage was doomed from the start. Dangerously in Love, the ultimate wedding night challenge. We've talked about Viking brides having power, but this next part, this is where things get genuinely terrifying. Picture your wedding night. Now picture your new spouse demanding you fight armed men to prove you deserve them. Not metaphorically. Actually fight with weapons. Where people could die. That's what some Viking grooms faced. And the brides, they watched, judged, decided if their husband lived up to expectations. Because if he didn't, well, that's where this gets really dark. The sagas don't sugarcoat this stuff. Gisla Saga tells us about a bride who straight up refused to consummate her marriage until her groom survived a night keeping watch against attackers. Real attackers who might actually show up and kill him. She's lying there in the bridal bed while he's outside with a sword, possibly fighting for his life. Think about that power dynamic for a second. Your wedding night becomes a literal survival test. No pressure, right? Just prove you won't get murdered protecting your new wife. Here's what gets me about these challenges. They weren't random cruelty. Viking women needed to know their husbands could defend them when raiders came at 3 a.m. If your groom couldn't handle one planned challenge on his wedding night, how's he going to react when real enemies show up unexpectedly? So they tested them hard. Some brides arranged actual ambushes, male relatives hiding in shadows with weapons. The groom had to fight through them to reach his bride. People got hurt, sometimes seriously. The physical tests were brutal enough, but some brides got creative. Intellectual challenges, riddle contests, where wrong answers meant public humiliation. Navigate by stars to prove you could lead raiding expeditions. Recite law codes to show wisdom. Compose poetry on demand. Fail any of these, your new wife might declare you inadequate before the assembled wedding guests. The shame was incredible. In a culture where reputation meant everything, Intellectual failure on your wedding night could destroy your standing permanently. Smart brides used this ruthlessly. But the most extreme tests, these are the ones that kept me up researching. Brides who sent grooms to retrieve dangerous treasures from enemy clans, steal valuable items from hostile neighbours, basically ordering your new husband to commit what amounts to a suicide mission before you'll sleep with him. Some grooms never came back. The bride would wake up a widow after her first night of marriage. And according to the sagas, some of them planned it that way, arranged their own husband's death through impossible challenges. Laxdala saga describes Guthrun making her husband Thorvald retrieve a valuable cloak from a rival's household on their wedding night. Not just any rival, a dangerous one. Known for violence, she's essentially saying, "Risk death to prove you love me." And he goes, because refusing would be even worse than dying. The social consequences of backing down from your wife's challenge on your wedding night. Complete destruction of your reputation. Better to die trying than live as a coward. That's the mental calculation these men made. Now here's the twisted part. Some women used these tests to escape unwanted marriages. Arranged marriages were common. Daughters had little choice in husbands. But if you could design a challenge impossible enough, deadly enough, you might become a widow before becoming a wife. Set up a genuine ambush. Pick an enemy strong enough to kill your groom. Watch your unwanted husband die heroically, attempting your test. Tragic accident. Nobody's fault. Except it wasn't accidental at all. It was calculated murder disguised as tradition. The psychology behind this is fascinating and terrifying. These women lived in a world where they had almost no legal power, couldn't choose their husbands, couldn't divorce easily, but they could test. And testing gave them life or death authority over men. For one night, they held complete power. They could demand impossible tasks. Watch strong men risk everything to prove themselves worthy. Some enjoyed it. The control, the fear in their groom's eyes, the knowledge that this powerful warrior was willing to die for their approval. Dark power, but real power. Archaeological evidence backs up the violence. Grave goods from high-status Viking women include weapons alongside domestic items. These weren't decorative. They knew how to fight, how to kill. So when a bride arranged her wedding night test, she wasn't some helpless maiden hoping for protection. She was a potentially deadly woman evaluating whether her groom measured up to her standards. If he failed, well, she might not need him anyway. She could handle threats herself. The test wasn't just about his capabilities. It was about whether he deserved her. The social pressure on grooms was unimaginable. Refuse your bride's challenge. Everyone knows you're a coward. Complete it successfully. You've earned respect and your wife's approval. Fail attempting it. At least you died honourably trying, but survive the attempt while failing the actual task. That's the worst outcome. You're branded as both incompetent and lucky, neither brave enough to succeed nor unlucky enough to die. A living reminder of your own inadequacy. Some men chose more dangerous challenges rather than risk this middle ground of public humiliation. The timing made everything worse. These tests happened when grooms should have been happiest. Wedding accomplished, family alliance secured, beautiful bride waiting. Instead, they faced potential death. The psychological torture of having everything you wanted within reach, then being told you might die before you can enjoy it. And your wife, your new wife, is the one demanding you risk it all. She's testing whether you'll literally die for her approval, on what should be the best night of your life. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Some challenges were designed to be survivable, but transformative. Combat tests where the groom faced multiple opponents, but with weapons that couldn't kill, only injure and humiliate. Endurance trials where exhaustion was the enemy, not death. Public competitions where failure meant mockery, not murder. These lighter tests still carried real danger. Injuries could become infected. Exhaustion could lead to mistakes. Humiliation could destroy reputations permanently. Even the safe challenges weren't actually safe. They just offered better odds of survival while maintaining the testing dynamic that gave brides power. The most chilling accounts describe brides who showed no emotion during their husbands' trials, watched dispassionately as men fought for their lives, made notes about technique, courage, strategy, evaluated performance like judges at a competition. If the groom died, they mourned appropriately. If he succeeded, they rewarded him. But during the actual test, cold calculation. This wasn't love or romance. This was practical assessment of a business partner who might need to defend your household, raise your children, manage your property. Emotion was a luxury they couldn't afford. Failed grooms faced fates worse than death. Public mockery, divorce, social exile. Some left their communities entirely, joining raiding expeditions where they could die honourably rather than live shamefully. Others challenged their ex-wives' male relatives to combat, trying to restore honour through violence. This created blood feuds lasting generations. One failed wedding night test could destroy multiple families through cycles of revenge. The stakes weren't just individual, they were communal. Fail your bride's test, and everyone suffers the consequences. No pressure at all, right? Legal codes from medieval Scandinavia mention women's rights to demand proof from husbands and divorce for inadequacy. These laws didn't appear overnight. They evolved from customs like wedding night testing. Women's authority to evaluate and reject men became institutionalized. What started as dangerous trials became legal precedent. The power to test husbands transformed into broader rights within marriage. But the underlying message remained. Men had to prove themselves worthy continuously. Wedding night success was just the beginning. The real test was lifelong performance under scrutiny. Which brings us to the ultimate question these tests raised. What happens when grooms don't just fail, but die? When wedding night challenges become wedding night murders? When testing becomes execution? Because that's where this story gets truly dark. Some brides didn't just want to evaluate their husbands, they wanted to eliminate them entirely. And the methods they used, the elaborate death traps disguised as romantic challenges, that's what we're exploring next. Sweet dreams thinking about that. Fatal fails, the cost of wedding night tests. Here's where this gets dark. You're a Viking groom. Your bride just handed you an impossible task. Retrieve a sacred weapon from hostile territory. Fight 3 armed men alone. Solve a riddle that has no answer. And you fail. The silence in that room must have been deafening, because failure didn't just mean no consummation. It meant your life as you knew it was over. Divorce, humiliation, sometimes exile. This wasn't just about proving yourself anymore. The sagas don't sugarcoat what happened next. Take Björn from the Laxdala saga. His bride demanded he swim across an icy fjord to prove his strength. Middle of winter, water so cold it could kill you in minutes. He made it halfway, had to turn back, shivering, defeated. She declared the marriage void before he even dried off, packed his belongings, sent him home to his father in shame. That's not romantic drama, that's social execution by freezing water and wounded pride. Immediate divorce wasn't just paperwork either. The bride's family kept the bride price, all of it. Meanwhile, the groom's family had to return her dowry. That's double financial devastation. Imagine losing your life savings twice in one night. Some families went bankrupt from failed wedding tests, had to sell land, livestock, everything. The economic consequences rippled through entire communities. One failed groom could impoverish multiple generations. Makes you wonder how many men avoided marriage entirely, rather than risk that kind of catastrophe. But the money was nothing compared to the reputation damage. Vikings lived and died by honour. A man who failed his wedding night test became a public joke. Poets would compose verses mocking his cowardice. Children would whisper his name as an insult. Women would refuse to speak to him. Even his own family sometimes disowned him to protect their reputation. The Egil's saga mentions a failed groom whose own father changed the family name to avoid association. That's how toxic these failures became. Some men tried to fight back against the humiliation, challenge their ex-wives' male relatives to combat, demand single combat to restore their honor. But here's the brutal part. If you already failed one test of courage, who's going to believe you're suddenly brave now? Most of these revenge duels went badly. Really badly. The sagas describe failed grooms getting killed, trying to reclaim honor they'd already lost. It was like doubling down on a losing hand, except the stakes were literally life and death. The psychological damage was probably the worst part. Imagine building your entire identity around being a Viking warrior. Strong, brave, capable. Then one night, one test, proves you're none of those things. Some men never recovered mentally. The Greta's saga describes a failed groom who became a hermit, living alone in the wilderness because he couldn't face other people. Another saga mentions a man who became mute after his failure, literally unable to speak from shame. These weren't just wounded egos, these were shattered souls. Then there's the exile option. Some failed grooms just left, packed whatever belongings they could carry, and walked away from everything they'd ever known. Their farms, their families, their communities. Better to be unknown somewhere else than infamous at home. Archaeological evidence suggests Viking Age Scandinavia had a significant population of rootless men who'd fled their origins. Makes you wonder how many were escaping wedding night disasters rather than seeking adventure. Sometimes running away was the only dignified option left. The ripple effects hit entire family networks. Your brother fails his wedding test. Your family's reputation takes damage. Your son can't complete his bride's challenge. Future marriage negotiations become harder for everyone. The Njal saga describes a clan where 3 sons failed wedding tests in consecutive years. By the 4th year, no respectable family would negotiate marriages with them at all. One generation of failures could doom the next generation to remain unmarried. The stakes weren't just personal, they were generational. Some failures were spectacularly public too. Wedding celebrations involved the entire community. Everyone watching when the groom got his test. Everyone witnessing when he failed. The Volsunga saga describes a groom who fainted during his trial by combat, right there in front of hundreds of guests. They had to carry him out unconscious while his bride declared the marriage void. Imagine waking up to discover you'd failed so badly that fainting was your body's escape mechanism. Public humiliation doesn't get much worse than that. The community consequences were harsh but practical from a Viking perspective. A man who couldn't handle his wedding night test probably couldn't handle real combat either. He'd be a liability in raids, unreliable in feuds, useless when enemies attacked. So communities had incentives to make failed grooms unwelcome. Better to force them out than risk everyone's safety on someone who'd already proven inadequate. It sounds cruel, but in a world where survival depended on group strength, weakness was genuinely dangerous to everyone. Legal protections for failed grooms were basically non-existent. If your bride declared the marriage void due to your inadequacy, that was it. No appeals process. No second chances. The law sided with brides who could prove their husbands had failed legitimate tests. This gave women tremendous power, but also created a system where one bad night could destroy a man's entire future. Some historians argue this actually protected women by ensuring only genuinely capable men could stay married, but the human cost was enormous. Not all failures were about combat either. Some grooms failed intellectual tests and faced equal humiliation. The Havamal mentions riddle contests, where wrong answers meant divorce. Imagine your marriage ending because you couldn't solve a word puzzle correctly, or failing because you didn't know enough poetry, couldn't recite genealogies properly, didn't understand navigation techniques well enough. In a culture that valued wit alongside strength, being outsmarted by your bride was just as shameful as being outfought. Mental failures carried the same social death sentence. The timing made everything worse. Wedding failures happened at the moment of maximum vulnerability. You're exhausted from the ceremony, probably drunk from celebrating, emotionally invested in your new life, then suddenly everything crashes down. No time to prepare mentally, no chance to practice or train. The test comes when you're least ready to handle it. Some sagas suggest this timing was intentional, that brides wanted to catch grooms off guard to see their true character. Brutal but effective psychological warfare disguised as marriage tradition. Recovery from wedding night failure was possible but rare. A few sagas describe men who eventually rebuilt their reputations through exceptional acts of bravery or wisdom years later. But it took extraordinary effort. One failed groom reportedly spent 5 years on dangerous trading voyages, accumulating wealth and proving his courage, before anyone would consider him marriage-worthy again. Another became a famous skald, using poetry to rebuild his reputation word by word. These success stories were exceptions, though. Most failed grooms never recovered socially. The pressure created by these potential consequences probably shaped Viking masculinity in profound ways. Every young man knew that one night, one test, could determine his entire future. That knowledge must have driven them to train harder, study more, prepare for challenges they couldn't predict or control. The fear of wedding night failure might have made better warriors and thinkers, but at what psychological cost? Living your whole life knowing that marriage itself could destroy you, that's a different kind of pressure than modern men face. These failures reveal something important about Viking society's values. They prioritized group survival over individual happiness so completely that destroying a man's life over one failed test seemed reasonable. Modern marriage focuses on love, compatibility, mutual support. Viking marriage focused on strength, capability, alliance building. Both systems have their logic, but only one leaves room for second chances after failure. Understanding their harsh consequences helps us appreciate both their practical reasons and our own gentler approach to marital disappointment. Surviving humiliation, the aftermath. The morning after failure was worse than the test itself. Word travelled fast in Viking settlements, and I mean fast. By sunrise everyone knew. The thralls whispered while milking goats. Children giggled behind their hands. Even the dogs seemed to avoid you. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was social death. In a culture where your reputation literally determined whether you lived or died, failing your wedding night test wasn't just personal humiliation. It was complete annihilation of everything you thought you were. The sagas describe it in brutal detail. Men who couldn't complete their bride's challenges became objects of public mockery. Poets, and Vikings loved their poets, would compose verses about your failure. They'd perform them at feasts, at gatherings, wherever people needed entertainment. Imagine having your worst moment turned into a song that everyone sang. These poems had names, Nukkad poems, verses specifically designed to destroy a man's honour. Once a Nukkad poem started making rounds, your reputation was finished. But here's what made it even worse. Your family suffered too. Viking society was collective. Your failure didn't just reflect on you. It reflected on your father, your brothers, your entire lineage. Suddenly, marriages that were being negotiated for your siblings got called off. Trading partnerships became harder to maintain. Your family's honour, built over generations, could crumble because you couldn't solve a riddle or fight off 3 drunk cousins on your wedding night. The social mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Some men tried to laugh it off. Bad strategy. Vikings respected many things. Self-deprecating humour wasn't one of them. The sagas mention failed grooms who tried to joke about their failures at feasts. Big mistake. The crowd didn't laugh with them. They laughed at them. Hard. Mockery built on mockery, until these men became permanent entertainment, living jokes. Their presence at gatherings became a guarantee of amusement, not the kind of legacy anyone wanted carved on their runestone. Others went the opposite direction, complete social withdrawal. They'd avoid feasts, stop visiting the marketplace, basically disappear from community life. But isolation didn't solve the problem. It just confirmed everyone's suspicions that you were weak. Vikings valued participation, contribution, showing up when your neighbours needed help. A man who hid after failure proved he couldn't handle pressure, which meant he definitely couldn't handle raiders, or famines, or the 100 other crises that required community cooperation. The economic consequences were immediate and devastating. Remember, Vikings lived in a reputation-based economy. Your word was your currency. Failed grooms found their trading relationships drying up. Who wants to make deals with someone who can't complete basic challenges? Craftsmen lost customers. Farmers couldn't negotiate good prices for their crops. Even simple transactions became complicated when everyone doubted your competence. Poverty followed humiliation with mathematical precision. Then there were the marriage prospects, or lack thereof. News of wedding night failures spread across the entire region. Other families heard about your humiliation and immediately crossed you off their lists. No father wanted his daughter married to a proven failure. Even families with daughters who weren't particularly attractive or wealthy would reject your proposals. You'd gone from eligible bachelor to completely unmarriageable in one disastrous night. In a culture where marriage was essential for economic survival, this was catastrophic. Some failed grooms tried desperate redemption strategies. They'd challenge random people to fights, hoping to rebuild their reputation through violence. Usually backfired spectacularly. Either they lost, adding more humiliation to their collection, or they won against someone weaker, which proved nothing. Vikings had sophisticated ideas about honourable combat. Beating up someone significantly smaller or weaker than you didn't restore honour. It just made you look like a bully. Plus, now you had enemies on top of everything else. The psychological toll was enormous. Viking men were raised from childhood to value courage, strength, and competence above everything else. Failing a wedding night test meant confronting the possibility that everything you'd been taught about yourself was wrong, that you weren't brave, weren't smart, weren't worthy of respect. Modern psychology would recognize this as a massive identity crisis. Vikings just called it shame, deep soul-crushing shame that could drive men to extreme measures. This is where things got dangerous. Failed grooms often became violence-prone, not because they were naturally aggressive, but because they were desperate to prove their worth somehow. The sagas describe men picking fights with former friends, challenging rivals to duels, even starting blood feuds with their ex-wives' families. Violence became their last resort for restoring honour. Sometimes it worked. More often, it made everything worse. Dead martyrs got more respect than living failures. Many chose exile instead. They'd pack their few belongings and leave their home communities entirely, seeking places where their humiliation wasn't known. This actually made sense. Viking society was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, but large enough that you could disappear if you travelled far enough. Iceland, Greenland, even distant trading posts offered fresh starts, new identities, the chance to be someone other than that guy who failed his wedding test. Some joined raiding expeditions specifically to die honourably. Better to fall in battle than live with shame, they reasoned. Viking culture promised that warriors who died fighting would feast in Valhalla forever. Meanwhile, cowards faced punishment in the afterlife. So failed grooms would volunteer for the most dangerous raids, the longest voyages, the battles with the worst odds. Death in combat could retroactively restore honour to their family name. Others became obsessed with wealth accumulation. If they couldn't prove their worth through courage or marriage, maybe they could buy respect. They'd become merchants, traders, even mercenaries, anything that might generate enough wealth to overwhelm their reputation problems. Rich failures were still failures, but at least people would pretend to respect them. Money couldn't completely erase shame, but it could make the shame more bearable. The few who successfully rebuilt their lives had one thing in common: patience. They accepted that redemption would take years, maybe decades. They'd quietly rebuild their skills, prove their competence in small ways, slowly earn back trust and respect. No dramatic gestures, no quick fixes, just steady, consistent demonstration that their wedding night failure was an anomaly, not their true character. It worked, but it required incredible mental toughness. What's fascinating is how these failures sometimes benefited society. Desperate to prove themselves, failed grooms often pushed boundaries. They'd explore new territories, develop new trading routes, innovate better farming techniques, anything to distinguish themselves. Some of the most significant Viking achievements came from men with something to prove. Failure, when channeled properly, could drive extraordinary success, though most failed grooms never reached those heights. The aftermath reveals how completely Vikings prioritized honor over happiness. Modern couples who face relationship problems get counseling, work on communication, maybe separate amicably. Vikings who failed their wedding tests faced social annihilation, no second chances, no therapy, no graceful exits, just the brutal reality that in a culture where reputation was everything, losing your honor meant losing your place in society forever. That's the price they paid for building their lives around strength and courage. The complexity of motivations. Here's what we need to understand about these Viking brides. They weren't monsters. They were women trapped in a system where one bad marriage could literally kill them. Think about it. Your husband dies in a raid. You're defenseless. He's a coward who runs from fights. Your family's honor is destroyed. These wedding night tests weren't sadistic games. They were survival checks. Because in a world where wolves and raiders could attack any winter night, marrying the wrong man was a death sentence. Put yourself in their position for a second. You're maybe 16 years old. Your father just arranged your marriage to a complete stranger. This man will control your property, father your children, and defend your household when violence comes. And violence will come. You get one chance, one night, to figure out if he's actually capable of keeping you alive. That changes everything, doesn't it? That test isn't cruelty. It's the most important job interview of your life. Some brides were genuinely trying to find strength in their new husbands. Take Sigrid the Strong from the sagas. She makes her groom fight 3 of her brothers before their wedding night. Not to humiliate him, but because she'd watched her first husband die in battle, leaving her with nothing. This time she wanted proof. If he couldn't handle her brothers in a controlled fight, how would he face actual enemies? She was testing for competence, not entertainment. But other motivations were darker. Some brides used tests as weapons against unwanted marriages. If your father forced you to marry a man you despised, well, you couldn't refuse directly. That would dishonor your family. But you could arrange a test so difficult, so dangerous, that failure was almost guaranteed. The groom dies or flees. Not your fault. You were just following tradition. It was the only form of rebellion available to women who had no legal right to say no. The sagas tell us about Gudrun Osvifsdottir, forced to marry a man she found repulsive. So she sends him to retrieve a magical ring from a sorcerer's cave on their wedding night. Everyone knows it's impossible. The groom dies trying, and Gudrun gets to remarry someone she actually wanted. Was she evil, or was she a teenager using the only power she had to escape a life sentence with someone she couldn't stand? The answer isn't simple. Remember, these women had seen what happened to wives of weak men. They'd watched neighbors starve when cowardly husbands couldn't protect harvests from raiders. They'd seen friends beaten by husbands they couldn't respect. In their world, a strong husband wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between thriving and dying. So when a bride tested her groom's courage, She was literally testing whether her future children would eat or starve. That kind of desperation makes people do extreme things. Some tests were about establishing power dynamics from day one. A bride who could make her husband jump through hoops on their wedding night was proving she wasn't going to be a silent, obedient wife. She was setting expectations. This matters because Viking women ran entire farms while their husbands were away raiding. They needed husbands who would respect their authority, not undermine it. The wedding night test was like saying, "I'm not your servant, I'm your partner." And some motivations were purely practical. Imagine marrying someone you've never really talked to. You know his reputation, maybe, but reputations lie. Is he actually brave or just good at bragging? Can he think under pressure or does he panic? A well-designed test could reveal personality traits that years of normal conversation might never uncover. It was like speed dating with swords, brutal but efficient. And in a culture where divorce was possible, why not find out immediately? The complexity shows up in the variety of tests. Some brides tested physical courage, make him fight armed men, or survive alone in the wilderness overnight. Others tested loyalty, send him to refuse a powerful rival's demands, or return stolen property to enemies. Still others tested wisdom, riddles, legal questions, or strategic puzzles. Each bride was looking for something specific, not just is he strong, but is he the kind of strong my particular life will need? Think about Thordis Olafsdottir from Gisla Saga. She tests her groom by making him stay awake all night guarding against potential attackers. Why? Because her previous husband had been killed in his sleep during a raid. She wasn't being cruel, she was checking if this man could actually protect their bed when danger came in the darkness. Her test was born from trauma, from experience, from the very real knowledge that sleeping men die and their wives become widows. Some brides were testing for something even more subtle, respect. Would this man listen to a woman's commands? Would he take her seriously when she gave him challenges? Because in daily life, she'd need him to trust her judgment about crops, animals, household management, and child rearing. A husband who couldn't respect his wife's intelligence on their wedding night probably wouldn't respect it later either. The test was checking for partnership potential, not just physical capability. The most tragic cases involve brides who were testing for basic humanity. Some women had been married off to men with reputations for cruelty or violence toward women. The wedding night test became a way to see how he'd react to challenge, to frustration, to not getting what he wanted immediately. Would he become angry, violent, or would he show patience, humour, cleverness? For these brides, the test was literally checking if their new husband would abuse them later. But we also have to acknowledge the manipulative motivations. Some brides used tests to humiliate men they felt were beneath their social status. If you're the daughter of a famous warrior, and your father makes you marry some farmer's son for political reasons, well, making him fail publicly might be your revenge. It's petty, it's cruel, but it's also very human. These women had pride, ambition, and class consciousness just like everyone else. Not all motivations were noble. The most complex cases involved brides who were testing multiple things at once. Strength and wisdom and loyalty and respect, all in one elaborate challenge. These women were playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. They designed tests that would reveal everything they needed to know about this stranger they'd have to live with for decades. It was sophisticated psychological evaluation disguised as barbaric tradition, and honestly, pretty brilliant considering the circumstances they were working within. What's remarkable is how many brides tried to be fair within an unfair system. They gave their grooms genuine chances to succeed. The tests were difficult but not impossible if you were actually the warrior you claimed to be. If you really were brave, clever, and strong, you'd pass. If you were just good at talking, well, your wedding night would expose that. It was harsh, but it was honest. more honest than a lifetime of marriage built on lies about who someone really was. These Viking brides weren't villains or victims. They were women using the only power their culture gave them. In a world where they couldn't choose their husbands, they could at least test them. Where they couldn't refuse marriage, they could make it conditional. Were some cruel? Absolutely. Were others just trying to survive in an impossible situation? Also, absolutely. Like women everywhere, throughout history, they were doing the best they could with terrible options, and sometimes that looked like making their husbands fight for their lives on their wedding night. Varying rights across social strata. Here's what the sagas don't tell you. All those dramatic wedding night tests we've been talking about, they were basically rich people problems. Your average Viking farmer couldn't afford to have his new wife send him off on some death-defying quest, because, well, the cows needed milking in the morning, the fields needed tending, survival was too immediate for elaborate honour games. While elite families were playing deadly riddle contests, working-class Vikings were just trying to make it through winter alive. Think about it practically. If you're a fisherman's daughter marrying a blacksmith's son, you can't send him off to steal treasure from the neighbouring clan. That's your neighbour. You need to trade with them next week. Your wedding night test might be, can he mend nets? Might be, does he know which mushrooms are poisonous? Can he spot a storm coming? These weren't romantic ideals. These were survival skills. The sagas focus on jarls and wealthy landowners because their drama made better stories. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Most Viking settlements were small farming communities, where everyone knew everyone else's business. You couldn't arrange surprise ambushes or mysterious challenges when there were maybe 30 adults total, and they all lived within shouting distance. Wedding night tests in these communities were more like proving you could handle the family's livestock, or showing you knew how to preserve meat for winter. Still tests, just practical ones that kept everyone alive. Regional differences were huge too. Norwegian mountain communities had completely different priorities than Danish coastal settlements. Up in the fjords, your wedding night test might involve proving you could navigate in whiteout conditions, or survive if an avalanche cut you off from the main settlement. Down by the sea, it might be about reading weather patterns or knowing which fish were safe to eat during different seasons. Same culture, completely different survival challenges. Iceland was its own weird case. These were settlers who'd left everything behind to start over on a volcanic island that regularly tried to kill them. Their wedding night traditions focused on adaptability. Could the new husband improvise solutions when things went wrong? Could he stay calm when the ground literally shook beneath his feet? Some Icelandic marriage customs included tests where the groom had to solve unexpected problems, like what to do if your only shelter collapsed. Swedish forest communities had their own thing going. Dense woods meant different dangers: wolves, bears, getting lost and dying of exposure. Wedding night tests here often involved woodland survival skills. Can you track game? Can you find your way home in the dark? Can you tell poisonous berries from safe ones? Again, not glamorous saga-worthy drama, but life or death practical knowledge that determined whether your family would eat or starve during the next harsh winter. The really interesting part is how social mobility affected these traditions. A successful raider who married up might face elite-style tests he wasn't prepared for. Conversely, a jarl's daughter who married down might abandon elaborate challenges for practical concerns. Your wedding night reflected not just what class you were born into, but what class you were joining. Marriage was social transition, and the tests evolved to match your new community's actual needs. Thrall marriages, that's where things get really different. Enslaved Vikings had no choice in partners, no bride price negotiations, no family honour to uphold. Their wedding nights were about proving basic competence to their owners. Can you work without supervision? Will you run away? Can you produce healthy children who will also be valuable property? Brutal, but that was the reality for maybe 30% of Viking Age Scandinavians who never appear in the heroic sagas. Trading communities developed their own unique customs. These were Vikings who lived by exchanging goods rather than farming or raiding. Their wedding night tests focused on commercial skills. Can you calculate fair exchange rates in your head? Do you know which furs are worth travelling hundreds of miles for? Can you spot counterfeit silver? These communities needed partners who could contribute to the family business, not necessarily warriors who could die gloriously in battle. Here's something the sagas completely ignore: older marriages. Second or third wives, widowers, people past their physical prime. A 40-year-old woman marrying a 50-year-old man wasn't going to stage elaborate combat trials. Their tests were about compatibility, shared resources, and combining existing households. Can you manage his children from previous marriages? Will your livestock get along? Do your seasonal work patterns complement each other? Practical partnership, not dramatic romance. Christian conversion created its own complications. Early converts tried to blend old traditions with new beliefs, creating hybrid customs that satisfied both Christian priests and traditional families. Wedding night tests became gentler. Instead of combat trials, maybe riddle contests about biblical knowledge. Instead of deadly quests, maybe proving you could recite prayers correctly. The underlying logic remained: test your partner's competence, but the specific tests evolved to match changing religious beliefs. Seasonal timing mattered too. Winter weddings in northern Scandinavia meant different tests than summer ceremonies. If you're marrying during the dark months when everyone's trapped inside together, your wedding night test might be about patience, storytelling ability, or skill at indoor crafts that would keep the household sane during months of forced proximity. Summer weddings could include outdoor challenges, travel tests, or demonstrations of farming knowledge. Women's tests varied by class too. An elite woman might demand her groom fight armed opponents, but a farmer's daughter might test whether he could deliver a difficult calf or repair a broken plough blade. Both were proving competence, but competence meant different things depending on what your daily life actually required. The core concept stayed consistent: ensure your partner can handle whatever your specific community throws at them. But the details changed completely. Some communities abandoned testing altogether during particularly brutal periods. If half your neighbours died in a plague or famine, you couldn't afford to be picky about marriage partners. Survival trumped honour. Archaeological evidence suggests that during crisis periods, Viking communities prioritised quick marriages that combined resources and labour. Wedding night became about immediate practical cooperation, building shelters, preserving food, caring for orphaned children, rather than proving abstract worthiness. The diversity gets even stranger when you consider Vikings who lived outside Scandinavia. Norse settlers in Ireland developed different customs than those in Russia or Greenland. Local conditions shaped their wedding traditions. A Viking bride in Dublin might test her groom's ability to navigate Irish legal customs or trade with Celtic neighbours. These communities blended Norse traditions with local practices, creating unique hybrid cultures that don't fit neat historical categories. What we're seeing here is that Viking wedding traditions were never uniform. They were living, breathing customs that adapted to local conditions, social class, economic needs, and historical circumstances. The sagas give us one narrow slice: elite families during relatively prosperous times. The real Viking world was messier, more diverse, more practical, and probably more interesting than the heroic stories suggest. Class mattered, location mattered, timing mattered, and survival always mattered most. Divine blessings, religious aspects. Here's what gets me about Viking weddings. They weren't just social contracts or political alliances. They were sacred ceremonies that called down the gods themselves. Every blessing, every sacrifice, every ritual word spoken over the couple was designed to weave divine protection around their union. The Vikings believed marriage without proper religious backing was doomed, So they developed elaborate ceremonies that would make modern couples nervous. Blood offerings, sacred oaths sworn before multiple gods, rituals that lasted days. The gods had to be invited properly. Vikings didn't mess around with this part. Freyja, goddess of love and fertility, got the first invocation, Thor for protection and strength, sometimes Odin for wisdom. Each deity required specific prayers, specific offerings. The bride and groom didn't just promise to love each other, they promised before the gods that their union would strengthen their families, produce strong children, and honour the divine order. Failure to include the gods meant cosmic consequences, and Vikings took cosmic consequences very seriously. Animal sacrifices weren't optional, usually horses or pigs, sometimes cattle if the families were wealthy. The blood wasn't just spilled, it was collected, mixed with sacred herbs, and used to bless the couple. They'd smear it on their foreheads, their hands, their wedding rings. Sounds brutal to us, but Vikings saw it as life force being transferred. The animal's strength, its vitality, its protective spirit joining with the marriage. Without blood sacrifice, the wedding lacked power. The gods wouldn't recognize it as legitimate. The blessing rituals followed ancient patterns. A Gothi, that's a Viking priest, would stand before the assembled families, holding a sacred hammer. Thor's symbol. He'd speak the old words, calling on each god by name, listing what the couple needed from them. Freyja, grant them passion, and many children. Thor, protect their household from enemies. Odin, give them wisdom to navigate conflicts. Each blessing required the couple to respond with specific phrases. Get the words wrong, and the whole ceremony had to restart. Location mattered enormously. Vikings held their most sacred wedding ceremonies at outdoor shrines, usually on hilltops or near sacred groves. These weren't random spots. They were places where the gods were believed to dwell, where the barrier between human and divine was thinnest. Some ceremonies happened at ancient stone circles, or near sacred springs. The idea was that divine power flowed stronger in certain locations. A wedding performed in the right place, with the right rituals, would literally channel godly protection into the marriage. Wedding rings carried religious significance beyond just being symbols. Viking rings were often inscribed with runes invoking specific gods or protective spells. Thor's hammer was a popular design. So were symbols representing Freya's fertility or Odin's ravens. The rings weren't just jewelry, they were amulets, protective talismans that would shield the marriage from supernatural threats. Some rings contained tiny pieces of iron from sacred objects, or silver that had been blessed at multiple shrines. The metal itself became holy through proper ritual treatment. Freyja dominated Viking wedding ceremonies for obvious reasons. She governed love, sexuality, fertility, and women's power within marriage. The bride would often wear amber jewelry dedicated to Freyja, or carry flowers that were sacred to her. Special prayers asked Freyja to make the union passionate, to grant the couple many healthy children, and to protect the wife during childbirth. Some ceremonies included rituals where the bride would symbolically receive Freyja's blessing through sacred mead or by handling objects associated with the goddess. Thor's protection was equally crucial. Marriage created new households that needed defending, new family units that enemies might target. The groom often wore a Thor's hammer pendant during the ceremony and swore oaths by Thor's strength. Sacred hammers, sometimes actual weapons, sometimes ceremonial replicas, were used to bless the couple's future home, their livestock, their children. Thor represented the defensive power that would keep the family safe from raiders, rival clans, supernatural threats, and natural disasters that could destroy everything they built together. Odin's role was more subtle, but equally important. The All-Father governed wisdom, poetry, and the complex social bonds that held Viking society together. Wedding ceremonies often included tests of wit or poetry contests, with Odin's blessing invoked over the cleverest participants. The idea was that marriage required more than strength and fertility, It needed wisdom to navigate the complex web of family obligations, legal disputes, and social expectations that came with joining two households. Smart couples honoured Odin properly. The oaths themselves carried enormous spiritual weight. Vikings believed that promises made before the gods created binding supernatural contracts. Break your wedding vows, and you weren't just hurting your spouse, you were defying divine will. The Gothi would make the couple repeat their promises 3 times, once for each god being invoked. Some ceremonies required the couple to hold sacred objects while swearing, Thor's hammer, Freyja's amber, or ancient family swords that carried ancestral spirits. The gods were literally witnessing every word. Timing mattered as much as location. Vikings scheduled their most important weddings during religious festivals when divine power was strongest. Summer solstice was popular. Maximum daylight meant maximum divine blessing. Some families waited for Thor's Day, Thursday, to honour him specifically. Others chose dates that aligned with agricultural cycles, believing that marriages begun during planting season would be more fertile. The phases of the moon influenced timing too. Full moon weddings were thought to be especially blessed by Freyja. Community participation wasn't optional in Viking wedding blessings. Everyone present had a role in calling down divine favour. The families would chant together, sing sacred songs, or participate in ritual dances that honoured the gods. Children scattered flowers or herbs with religious significance. Elderly relatives recited genealogies that connected the couple to honoured ancestors. The entire community became part of the religious ceremony, creating a spiritual network that would support the marriage. Individual blessing wasn't enough. Divine favour required group participation. Christianity changed everything, but slowly. When Vikings began converting around 1000 CE, they didn't immediately abandon their religious wedding traditions. Instead, they blended them. Christian priests might bless the couple, while Thor's hammer still appeared on wedding rings. Animal sacrifice gradually disappeared, replaced by offerings of bread or mead. But the essential idea remained. Marriage needed divine blessing to succeed. Christian Vikings still believed their unions required supernatural protection, just from a different god using different rituals. Folk traditions proved remarkably persistent. Even after official Christianization, Viking wedding customs survived in modified forms. Brides still wore amber jewellery, though now it honoured the Virgin Mary instead of Freyja. Wedding rings still carried protective runes, reinterpreted as Christian symbols. Sacred springs became sites for Christian ceremonies, but locals still believed they held special power. The gods changed names and faces, but the underlying belief remained. Marriage was too important to leave unprotected by divine forces. Here's where it gets really interesting. Viking religious beliefs about marriage included divine sanction for divorce. If the gods hadn't truly blessed a union, if the religious ceremonies had been performed incorrectly, or if one spouse had violated their sacred oaths, then the marriage lacked divine approval. This created religious justification for ending failed marriages. Women could claim that their husband's incompetence or cowardice proved the gods had never accepted the union. Religious grounds for divorce were actually easier to obtain than legal ones. Wait until you hear about Viking divorce laws. What you're going to discover is that while these marriages began with elaborate religious ceremonies designed to last forever, they could end with shocking ease. Viking women had divorce rights that wouldn't be matched in most of Europe for another 1,000 years. And the religious justifications they used, they'd make modern divorce lawyers jealous. The same spiritual beliefs that bound couples together also provided surprisingly progressive ways to break those bonds when necessary. Surprisingly progressive. Viking divorce. Here's something that'll mess with your head about Vikings. We think of them as these brutal backwards warriors who treated women like property, but when it came to divorce, they were more progressive than most of Europe would be for another 1,000 years. A Viking wife could walk away from her marriage for reasons that would make modern divorce lawyers jealous, and she didn't need her husband's permission. didn't need a priest's blessing, didn't need years of legal proceedings. She could just leave. Think about that for a second. While medieval Christian women were stuck in marriages until death, Viking wives had options, real options, and the law backed them up. This wasn't some theoretical right buried in legal texts nobody understood. This was everyday reality for Viking women who found themselves married to men who couldn't cut it. The sagas are full of stories about wives who divorced their husbands for being, well, disappointing, and society supported them for it. So what could get a Viking husband divorced? Failure to provide, for starters. If your husband couldn't keep food on the table or protect the household, you could dump him. Makes sense in a survival-based culture, right? But it gets more specific. Impotence was grounds for divorce. So was refusing to have sex with your wife for 3 years. Vikings took the physical side of marriage seriously. No medieval Christian celibacy is wholly nonsense here. Here's where it gets really interesting. A Viking wife could divorce her husband for wearing women's clothing. Not once as a joke, but regularly. Cross-dressing was considered so shameful that it gave women legal grounds to leave. Why? Because Vikings valued masculine courage above almost everything else. A man who dressed like a woman was seen as fundamentally unfit for the responsibilities of marriage and protection. The divorce process itself was brilliantly simple. The wife had to declare her intention to divorce in front of witnesses. That's it. No lengthy legal proceedings. No begging permission from male relatives. She stood up, announced she was divorcing her husband, and explained her reasons. The witnesses would remember her words, making the divorce legally valid. Within hours, she could be packing her belongings and heading back to her family's household. But here's the brilliant part. She didn't leave empty-handed. Viking marriage law required the husband to return the bride's dowry in full, plus any property she'd brought to the marriage, plus sometimes additional compensation depending on the circumstances. This meant divorce wasn't just emotionally liberating, it was economically viable. A divorced Viking woman often left marriage wealthier than when she entered it. Talk about progressive. The sagas give us specific examples. In Laxdæla saga, Gudrun divorces her husband Thorvald because he's too poor to maintain their household properly. She stands up during a feast, announces the marriage is over, lists his failures as a provider, and walks out, takes her dowry, takes her personal property, and moves back with her father. Thorvald can't do anything about it. The law supports her completely. Another saga describes a wife divorcing her husband for being too fond of his sword. Basically, he was so obsessed with fighting and raiding that he neglected his household duties. She divorced him for abandoning his responsibilities as a husband and father. This wasn't about him being violent, it was about him being absent. Vikings expected husbands to balance warrior duties with family obligations. Compare this to medieval Christian Europe. There, marriage was considered a holy sacrament that couldn't be dissolved. Women were stuck with abusive, incompetent, or absent husbands until death. Divorce existed only in the most extreme cases and required expensive church proceedings that could take years. Most women had no realistic option to leave bad marriages. They just endured or died trying. Viking women, meanwhile, had genuine power to walk away, and society didn't shame them for it. A divorced woman wasn't seen as damaged goods or a social pariah. She was seen as someone who'd made a practical decision about her life. She could remarry easily, often to someone of higher status than her first husband. Divorce was treated like any other major household decision. This system worked because Viking society was intensely practical. Marriage existed to create strong family alliances and produce capable children. If a husband couldn't fulfill his role, why keep him around? It was better for everyone if incompetent husbands got replaced by better men. The community benefited from strong marriages and suffered from weak ones. Divorce wasn't personal failure, it was quality control. The witness requirement was crucial though. You couldn't just claim you'd divorced your husband and expect people to believe you. The witnesses had to be respectable community members who could testify about what they'd heard. Usually this meant announcing your divorce during a public gathering like a feast or thing meeting. Everyone would remember what was said and why. Social media had nothing on Viking gossip networks. Men could also initiate divorce, but their grounds were much more limited. Adultery was the main reason a husband could divorce his wife. But even then, the process was more complicated. He had to prove the adultery happened, which required witnesses or other evidence. Women's grounds for divorce were broader and easier to demonstrate. The law clearly favoured wives who wanted out of bad marriages. This connected to women's broader legal status in Viking society. They couldn't vote at the thing meetings or hold political office, but they had significant power within the domestic sphere. They managed household finances, made major purchasing decisions, and controlled their own property. Divorce rights were part of this pattern. Limited political power, but substantial personal autonomy. After Christianity took hold in Scandinavia around 1100 CE, these progressive divorce laws gradually disappeared. Christian marriage was indissoluble, and women lost their right to walk away from bad husbands. It would be centuries before European women regained anything close to the divorce rights Viking women had taken for granted. Progress isn't always linear. Sometimes societies actually move backwards. So next time someone talks about Vikings being primitive or backwards, remember this: 1,000 years ago, Viking women had divorce rights that were more comprehensive than what many women have today. They could leave incompetent husbands, keep their property, and start over without social stigma. That's not primitive, that's remarkably advanced. Sometimes the warriors were more progressive than the priests. Unravelling the literary evidence. Here's what makes Viking wedding stories tricky. Most of what we know comes from the Icelandic sagas, written centuries after the fact. Think about that for a second. These epic tales were composed around 1200 to 1300 CE, but they describe events from 800 to 1100 CE. That's like us writing definitive accounts of the American Civil War, based purely on family stories passed down through generations. Some details stay true, others get... The saga writers weren't historians, they were storytellers. Entertainment was the goal, not accuracy. So when Egil's saga describes a bride demanding combat trials, or Laxdæla saga mentions impossible wedding night quests, how much is real? How much is just good drama? Archaeological evidence helps, but graves don't preserve wedding night conversations. Legal codes mention women's marriage rights, but they're frustratingly vague about the specifics. We're piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. But here's what's convincing about the literary evidence. The details are too specific to be completely invented. When sagas describe particular weapons used in wedding tests, or name specific locations where trials happened, or mention exact legal procedures for divorce, that suggests real cultural memory. You don't make up those kinds of precise details. They come from lived experience, even if they've been exaggerated over time. The broad patterns ring true, even if individual stories got embellished. Archaeological evidence backs up some saga claims. High-status Viking women's graves contain weapons alongside jewellery and domestic tools. That matches saga descriptions of women who could fight and test their husbands' combat skills. We find evidence of ritual battles at wedding sites, mock combat that might have evolved from real testing traditions. The physical evidence doesn't prove every saga story, but it confirms the general picture of women with unusual authority in marriage decisions. Legal codes from medieval Scandinavia preserve fragments of older customs. Norwegian and Icelandic law books, written after Christianization but reflecting earlier practices, mention women's rights to demand various proofs from husbands. They describe legitimate grounds for divorce that match saga accounts: impotence, cowardice, failure to provide adequately. These dry legal texts confirm that Viking wives had real power, not just literary power. The laws wouldn't exist if the practices were purely fictional, but we have to acknowledge the limitations. The sagas were written by Christian authors, looking back at pagan ancestors. They might have exaggerated the barbaric aspects to make Christianity seem more civilized by comparison, or they might have romanticized Viking customs to create a heroic past worth celebrating. Modern nationalism has also shaped how we read these sources. Everyone wants their ancestors to be uniquely fierce or progressive, so we might see patterns that aren't really there. The judicial evidence is particularly interesting. Court records from medieval Iceland describe actual divorce cases where women cited their husbands' wedding night failures as grounds for separation. These aren't epic tales, they're mundane legal documents recording real disputes over property and reputation. When a 13th century Icelandic woman divorces her husband for proving inadequate during marriage trials, that suggests the custom was still happening centuries after the Viking Age officially ended. What's really striking is how consistent the patterns are across different sources. Sagas, law codes, court records, even early Christian sermons complaining about pagan wedding customs, they all describe similar practices. Women testing men, marriage as alliance building rather than romance, divorce as a woman's right when husbands proved inadequate. The specific details vary, but the broad themes remain remarkably consistent. That consistency suggests we're dealing with real cultural practices, not just literary invention. The literary evidence also reveals how these traditions evolved over time. Early sagas describe brutal, life-threatening tests. Later ones focus more on cleverness and riddles. By the time Christianity fully took hold, wedding night trials had become symbolic rather than deadly. This evolution makes sense. As society became more settled and less violent, marriage customs would have adapted accordingly. The core idea of testing remained, but the methods became less extreme. Foreign observers provide another layer of evidence. Arab traders, English monks, and Frankish diplomats who encountered Vikings all commented on their unusual marriage customs. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab explorer who lived among Vikings in the 920s, describes wedding ceremonies that include combat demonstrations and bride-initiated challenges to grooms. These outsider accounts, written by people with no reason to invent Viking customs, confirm that something genuinely unusual was happening in Scandinavian marriages. But we can't ignore the gaps in our knowledge. Most Vikings were illiterate farmers and fishermen whose stories never got written down. The sagas focus on elite families, jarls and wealthy landowners whose weddings were elaborate affairs. We have almost no direct evidence about how common people handled marriage. Did poor Viking brides test their grooms? Did they have the luxury of rejecting inadequate husbands? The literary evidence gives us a partial picture at best. What makes the evidence convincing, despite its limitations, is how it fits with everything else we know about Viking culture. This was a society that valued courage above almost everything else. Women managed households and farms, while men were away raiding. Honor and reputation determined social status. In that context, wedding night trials make perfect sense. They're consistent with Viking values, even if the specific stories might be exaggerated for dramatic effect. The evidence suggests these traditions persisted longer than we might expect. Some Icelandic families maintained wedding testing customs into the 1400s, centuries after conversion to Christianity. Remote communities kept old practices alive even as urban areas modernized. This persistence indicates the customs served real social functions, not just entertainment. People don't maintain elaborate traditions for centuries unless they're getting something valuable from them, in this case, stronger marriages and better family alliances. As we near the end of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what this evidence tells us about marriage more broadly. The Vikings weren't the only culture to treat marriage as a testing ground, rather than a romantic union. Ancient Greeks, medieval Japanese samurai, and various African societies all developed their own forms of marital trials. The specific tests varied, but the underlying logic was similar. Marriage was too important to leave to chance, or sentiment alone. The literary evidence, for all its limitations, preserves something important about human nature and marriage. It shows us a world where partnership required proof, where commitment was earned rather than simply declared, where women had agency even within patriarchal systems. These stories survived centuries of retelling because they captured something true about the challenges of building lasting relationships in a dangerous world. The details might be embellished, but the underlying wisdom remains relevant. So, as we prepare to draw our final conclusions about Viking marriage traditions, remember that we're working with imperfect evidence, fragments of sagas, scattered legal documents, archaeological hints, but sometimes fragments tell the most interesting stories. They force us to imagine, to fill in gaps with educated guesses, to acknowledge what we don't know, and what emerges from these literary shadows is a picture of marriage unlike anything in our modern world, brutal, practical, and surprisingly empowering for women. The legacy of Viking marriages. Here's what gets me about studying this stuff for years. These weren't just weird ancient rituals. They created something, a cultural DNA that's still alive today. When you look at modern Scandinavia, those countries leading the world in gender equality, that didn't come from nowhere. It came from 1,000 years of women who could divorce cowards, demand courage, and refuse inadequate husbands. The wedding night tests we've explored, they were building blocks of something bigger. Think about this for a second. Viking women lived in a world where they were legally subordinate to men. Couldn't vote, couldn't inherit equally, couldn't rule kingdoms, but they could look a warrior in the eye on his wedding night and say, "Prove you're worthy of me." They could send him into mortal danger as a test. They could divorce him the next morning if he failed. That's not powerlessness. That's a very specific, very dangerous kind of power. And here's where it gets really interesting. After Christianity swept through Scandinavia, the church tried to eliminate these practices. Priests called them barbaric. Kings made new laws, but the cultural memory that stuck around. Scandinavian folklore is full of strong women testing weak men. Their legal systems kept making divorce easier. Something about female agency survived the transition, even when the deadly tests disappeared. The form changed, the underlying principle didn't. Modern Norway, Sweden, Denmark, they consistently rank highest in global gender equality indices. Is that just coincidence? Or is there a direct line from Viking brides who could humiliate inadequate grooms to modern Nordic women leading companies, governments, and families? I think there's a connection, a cultural expectation that women have the right to demand competence from their partners, to refuse being taken for granted, to dissolve relationships that don't serve them. The wedding night tests also reveal something profound about how Vikings thought about strength. It wasn't just physical, mental toughness, emotional resilience, strategic thinking. A groom who couldn't solve riddles was as inadequate as one who couldn't fight. This created a culture that valued complex competence, not just brute force. And that's visible in modern Scandinavian society too. They prize intellectual achievement, emotional intelligence, collaborative leadership, the values that helped people survive Viking Age winters. What's fascinating is how practical this all was. We look back and see brutality, cruelty, impossible standards. But they saw survival insurance. A wife who didn't test her husband might discover his cowardice when raiders attacked their farm. A man who couldn't handle wedding night pressure would crumble under real combat stress. The tests weren't sadistic entertainment, they were quality control for life or death partnerships. Brutal, yes, but also rational given their world. And the divorce laws revolutionary for medieval Europe. While English or French women were trapped in marriages until death, Viking women could walk away from inadequate husbands, take their property, and start over. This wasn't modern feminism, it was economic pragmatism. A woman stuck with an incompetent husband was a liability to her family's survival. Better to cut losses early than watch resources drain away supporting someone who couldn't contribute. Cold logic, but effective. The sagas give us glimpses of how these dynamics played out across generations. Families that consistently chose strong partners through rigorous testing became wealthy, powerful, respected. Families that made poor marriages disappeared from the historical record. Natural selection applied to cultural practices. The communities that survived were the ones that had figured out how to identify and eliminate weakness before it could spread. The tests weren't just traditions, they were evolutionary advantages. But here's what really challenges modern thinking. These practices created genuine partnership. A husband who'd proven himself through deadly trials, who'd earned his wife's respect through competence demonstration, wasn't going to dominate through fear or tradition. He'd earned his position, and a wife who'd tested him knew exactly what she was getting. No illusions, no disappointments later. They'd negotiated power dynamics up front, with blood and sweat as currency, brutal honesty about what marriage really required. This explains something about Scandinavian culture that outsiders find confusing. The directness, the comfort with conflict, the expectation that everyone proves their worth rather than inheriting respect. Viking wedding nights institutionalized the idea that status must be earned repeatedly, that competence must be demonstrated publicly, that failure has consequences. Modern Scandinavians inherited this, they just applied it to boardrooms instead of battlefields. Same principles, different weapons. The archaeological record supports this cultural continuity. Medieval Scandinavian grave goods show women buried with both domestic tools and weapons, even centuries after Viking raids ended. Legal documents from the 1200s and 1300s preserve women's rights to property and divorce that were unusually broad for medieval Europe. The physical tests disappeared, but the underlying expectation that women could demand competence from men that survived in law, custom, and cultural memory. What does this mean for how we understand the past? Maybe medieval women weren't as powerless as we assume. Maybe survival cultures developed sophisticated systems for identifying and rewarding competence that we've dismissed as primitive. Maybe our ancestors were making rational choices that seem brutal only because we've forgotten what genuine scarcity feels like. The Vikings weren't being cruel, they were being honest about what partnership required in their world. And that raises uncomfortable questions about our own marriage culture. We've eliminated the deadly tests, the public humiliation, the immediate consequences for inadequacy. But have we eliminated the underlying need to prove worthiness as a partner? Or have we just made the evaluation process longer, more subtle, more devastating when it finally happens? Modern divorce rates suggest we're still figuring out compatibility, just with less efficient methods than Viking brides used. The genius of Viking wedding traditions was their honesty. They acknowledged that marriage is a high-stakes partnership requiring specific competencies. They created systems to evaluate those competencies before making permanent commitments. They built in escape routes when evaluations proved incorrect. It was harsh, dangerous, sometimes fatal, but it was also transparent, efficient, and aligned with the realities of their world. We can criticize their methods while respecting their practical wisdom. The legacy lives on in unexpected ways. When modern Scandinavian couples negotiate household duties with business-like efficiency, when Norwegian women expect emotional competence from male partners, when Danish divorce procedures emphasize practical asset division over emotional drama, echoes of Viking marriage culture persist. The forms evolved, but the expectation that partnerships require proven competence from both parties, that cultural DNA never died. It just adapted to new survival challenges. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, consider this. Maybe the Vikings understood something about partnership that we've forgotten. Maybe their brutal honesty about what marriage required was more merciful than our romantic illusions. They demanded proof of worthiness up front. We discover incompatibility after decades of disappointment. Their way was faster, clearer, and created cultural traditions that still benefit their descendants. Sleep well, pondering whether our great-grandchildren will judge our marriage customs as harshly as we judge theirs.